Welcome everyone to the first virtual field day for botany beginners. I'm Laura Walter, the Plant Materials Program Manager for the Tallgrass Prairie Center, and I'm here at Irvine Prairie today for our first tour. I'll be presenting parts of the tour, and then other parts of it will be presented by Justin Meissen, the Research and Restoration Program Manager for the TPC. The series of field days that we'll be doing is designed to enhance the experience and your learning that you did through the Botany Beginners program. And I want to let you know that if you are new to Botany Beginners and this is your first experience with us, please feel welcome to stay around today and come along with us. And then please go to the Tallgrass Prairie Center website, tallgrassprairiecenter.org, and find more information about the course, including the series of 6 recorded webinars that you'll find there. I want to thank our partners in this endeavor, the University of Northern Iowa, Green Iowa AmeriCorps, Practical Farmers of Iowa, and the specific people who are helping to make this possible today, who include Carrie Wellman, who's behind the camera filming me right now, Andy Dunham, who is our new Prairie on Farms Program Manager and who's filming Justin today, Stacy Miller, who's working behind the scenes, and Jorgen Rose of Practical Farmers of Iowa, whose voice and face you'll hear several times today. If you think of questions, please use the chat to ask them. Justin and I won't be able to see the chat, but Jorgen will be monitoring it. I want to let you know that this will be a shorter format than most of our webinars, but we will see if we can work some of your questions into today's visit. First, I'd like to start also by introducing you to the Urban Prairie project and give you some background information on that. Urban Prairie is a 77-acre prairie reconstruction project on land that was donated to the University of Northern Iowa Foundation by Mrs. Kathy Irvine in memory of her husband, David. Kathy's vision is for the prairie to become a resource for generations of students and community members to learn about Iowa's prairie heritage and appreciate its many benefits. The Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation holds the conservation easement on the property, which protects it for future generations in perpetuity, which, as our director, Laura Jackson, likes to say, is a very long time indeed. Over a 5-year period, the Tallgrass Prairie Center is working with the farm manager to seed sections of former crop ground with carefully designed diverse native prairie seed mixes and use best practices in establishment management to help make them be successful. For species that are difficult to establish from seed, we are transplanting greenhouse-grown plugs and rhizome cuttings into the prairie. We hope to eventually return nearly 100 prairie species to this site. This is a chance for us to apply the best practices that we know of to the seed mix design, the establishment techniques, and monitoring to be able to reconstruct a prairie plant community that will last for generations. We really wish that you could be here with us today because it's a gorgeous day in the prairie. The birds are singing, the bees are humming, and things are blooming. But we want to say that this isn't the only chance you have to explore this place. It is open to the public from dawn to dusk year-round, anytime the gravel road is passable. If you'd like information about visiting the site, including maps and directions on how to get here, please go to tallgrassprairiecenter.org and look for our pages on Urban Prairie. I think we're ready now to turn it over to Justin, who will be in one of the areas that was just planted this year, so a first-year planting.
All right. Okay, so I'm gonna do a quick sound check. Everybody can hear me? Can I get confirmation on that?
Yep, you sound good, Justin.
All right. Awesome. Okay, so welcome again to Urban Prairie. I'm standing here in one of the new planting areas that we just planted this year. So I'm just gonna have you take a quick look around. So basically what we're looking at up until the beans over there, this was area that was all planted in April and late March of this year. And so what we're going to be talking about in this session is kind of what to expect in a situation like that. So what should we, what kind of things can we look for in a first year planting, and what are the plants that we might expect to see? So, one of the things that we see here initially is just kind of a melange of different heights of plants. It looks pretty weedy, and that's because it is. And we'll talk a little bit more about the things that we can also see that are the native plants. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about, how to key in on some important species. So if you were out here just trying to get your bearings and trying to maybe assess this planting or just kind of get a sense of what's going on out here in terms of the vegetation, of course, what we would want to be doing is trying to find the most common species. What are the plants out here that are kind of everywhere? So one of the things that we see is this grass here, and this is oats. So one of the things that we like to do in our prairie restorations is plant a cover crop or a nurse crop along with our tallgrass prairie plants. And so those are great because they're annual species. They establish very rapidly. And so as you can see, it has certainly taken quite well at this site this year. And so one of the things that we are looking for in determining this plant as oats and a cover crop, it's a cool season grass. So it's a cool season annual grass, which there are definitely some cool season annual weed grasses, but most of the ones that we're going to experience are something like foxtail, which are warm season annual grasses. And so those are not going to flower until later in the summer. So we're seeing a cool season annual grass that we planted as a cover crop. Other cover crops that you might encounter out on a restoration site as a nurse crop are things like winter wheat. We actually did plant some winter wheat in here as well in the spring. Again, we're not trying to get a crop off of these necessarily. We're just trying to get something to establish. Other things you might see out there are cereal rye, which typically gets quite tall. We generally don't plant that. There are some potential issues with allelopathy, which is a chemical sort of interaction that can lead to decreased native plant establishment. Now, one thing you'll also notice here, and that you might be asking what's going on with these little squares out here, those are part of an experiment, but they also show us what this vegetation would look like had we not been mowing. So we've mowed this first year area once this year. It was about 2 weeks ago, and you can see what we're doing when we're mowing is we're really keeping the light levels to the ground high compared to when you don't mow. You just kind of get very tall weeds, even though they are annual weeds for the most part over there. So what are some of those weeds that we're looking at? We're going to focus our time in the mowed area because that's probably what you're looking for. So a couple of these weeds that we're looking at, one of the most common weeds that we see in any place in Iowa is dandelion. That you would expect to see that in a first year prairie planting. That's certainly something that typically will come up. Along with this here is a biennial plant called it's a lettuce. It's a prickly lettuce, and one of the unique characteristics of this weed is that it has milky sap. And so that's pretty unique characteristic. It's sort of a milky thistle, if you will, in the way it presents itself. So that's called prickly lettuce. A couple of the other weeds that we're seeing out here are mare's tail, so or horseweed, some people call it. It's sort of presenting itself in a little different way than we see it in other spots, but this is mare's tail, and you can see how when we cut it, it resprouts sort of at the base where we cut it. So it sort of presents itself in a very different way when we're doing mowing management the first year. While we're here, we may as well go take a look at what these weeds would look like if we hadn't mowed them. So this is mare's tail here. This is our probably the most common weed in this field, at least. And you can see how this very much different growth pattern, sort of one main stem, no branching. But once we mow it, we get almost sort of a bushy type. Similar situation here with our prickly lettuce. It's about to flower, not quite ready yet, but again, a biennial weed that is typical in a lot of post-agricultural fields. So I'm gonna check the time real quick. Looks like I'm doing pretty good. So at this point, I want to kind of transition into some of the good things that we're seeing out here. So we're seeing a lot of weeds. We're seeing annual weeds. Doesn't matter whether we planted anything or not, you're going to see those if you take a field out of agriculture. So what should we be looking for? What are some of the signs of a healthy, start to a restoration? So let's walk around and see if we can find some of those indicators that we'd like to see. So one of the things that I'm seeing out here, I'm keying in on flowers, of course. They're the colorful things. They're easy to see. And so we'll take a look at, I see two flowers here that are somewhat typical that you'd see in a first year planting. So this is one of the very common plants that we'll see, certainly in the second year planting that Laura's going to talk about. This is Heliopsis helianthoides, or false sunflower oxeye, a classic yellow sunflower-like plant, establishes quite rapidly. As you can see here, it's even beginning to flower in the first year. Another more typical first year flower is right here. And this might be familiar to us from Plants of the Day earlier in our webinar series. And this is Camicrysta fasciculata, which is partridge pea. And so this is, we got a little loss of phone here. Hopefully we can get that visual back.
Justin, while you're working on your video, can I ask a quick question from the chat?
Absolutely.
You mentioned some mowing earlier. Somebody asked, what height do you mow at for best results?
So this planting was mowed at, I believe, about 6 to 8 inches. So of course you can't get it dialed in all that accurately with a lot of the mowers, but somewhere around that 4 to 8 inches is typically gonna give you good results in the first year.
Great. It looks like your video's back. So.
All right, we got video. Okay, so partridge pea, again, an annual prairie plant. It's in the legume family. Of course, we remember that with these compound leaves. And this is actually related closely to sensitive plants. So that if you've ever played around with those plants that will close up their leaves when you touch them. So it's a relative of that plant. Let's keep walking around and see if we can find another typical prairie plants that we might see in our first year planting. So here's one I see that's a classic. So this is Black-Eyed Susan. This was one of our plants of the day. We're seeing this one blooming in the first year. Now it is a short-lived perennial, but it can act as a biennial or an annual. So this plant probably is going to just produce seed and die. So especially in the first, if they're blooming so quickly, often they'll have a shorter life cycle like that. So some of the other things that we're looking here, again, it's important to get down into the vegetation. So all of our seedlings are here. We're seeing, I'm seeing quite a lot of native seedlings here. But I just want to make a point, and I want to make an illustration that they are very small. So while we did see some of the larger seedlings that are, flowering already, there's tons. The majority of the seedlings are actually really, really small. So I've got this little paper ruler to show you. This is a native seedling. This is Desmodium canadense, and that's clocking in at under 3 inches. So next to that is Lespedeza capitata, which is prairie bush clover, roundhead bush clover. Again, less than 3 inches tall. And we have another native grass very close to that. This one appears to be, that one's a little too young for me to get a good idea on that immediately. But again, about 6 inches tall. So these are very small seedlings. So if you come out here in your first season, especially around this time of year, late summer, don't be too concerned if this is what you're seeing. You're not seeing the native plants that you might have expected. They are here, they're just very small. So typically recommend coming out later in the year to assess these plantings when we do have a little bit more growth on the natives. But also coming out of the second year, which Laura Walter is going to be talking about actually maybe even just about now. I think we might be right on time. So
Okay.
Andy's gonna pan over to the area where Laura's gonna be talking.
Justin,
So you can
I ask a couple questions really quick from the chat?
Yes.
So
Yes.
we had a question about what was growing on the field before it went into the restoration. Does it come out of corn or soybeans?
So this came out of soybeans, which is ideal because there's very little litter, crop residue to impede seed to soil contact. So we drill right into that bean stubble. There was a cover crop planted in the fall as well, oats, which was frost kill. And so some of these oats that you see are probably coming back from that, but the majority of the oats are from the nurse crop we planted this year.
I mean, another question about the partridge pea and whether or not it will reseed itself.
Yeah, so partridge pea will reseed itself. However, once Laura takes over, the difference in vegetation quality. Partridge pea, you can see, is a pretty short plant. Definitely doesn't do that well when it's shaded out. And what you'll see, I think, is that as the prairie matures, there becomes a much less appropriate habitat for that plant. So it'll eventually kind of decline over time. So you'll see it sometimes come up in good years, but it won't become a really significant part of the plant community because it is sort of an early successional species.
All right, I think we can transition to Laura now. We did have a request, and Laura and Justin, if you can relay these to your videographers, that we keep the camera still for longer when we're showing the little team, especially.
Okay. So Carrie, I'm going to relay this to you. Carrie can't hear this conversation, so it's been requested that especially when we show close-ups, that we hold the camera still for a longer period of time. It may feel a little bit odd from our perspective. Yeah, but it's going to help our viewers. If I get a little distracted here, it's because I'm being visited by some of the many pollinators that are present here on site. I've got 2 different species of sweat bees on my hand right now, and I know Carrie had some that were on her phone earlier. But yeah, I'm standing right here. Carrie and I are standing at sort of the transition zone between a second-year planting over on this side and a third-year planting that is on my right, so your left. And so we'll look at just kind of the general vegetation. As you look out across this second year planting and certainly the third year planting, almost everything that you're seeing now is native. And I think that it's very clear. If you were here in person, I'd say, what else do you notice about this area? And a couple of things that I notice are that just overall the height of the vegetation is much greater. Clearly it's not being mowed, so that helps to explain some of that. But the canopy of it is also much more filled in, much more dense. So we have some overall changes in that plant community that result after it's been mowed during that establishment year, and then gets a chance to fill in during the second year. It's pretty amazing transformation. So we're going to see a couple of the plants that Justin talked about over in the first year planting. We'll also see those here in the second year planting. There are abundant flowering black-eyed Susans. And he mentioned that this is a relatively short-lived perennial species, even acting as an annual or biennial in cases. We have other species that are also perennial native plants, but are relatively short-lived. Much of what you see as you look out across here is this grass species, Canada wild rye. It's known for those graceful nodding spikes that it has. It kind of appears almost like an ear of wheat, like from my growing up years in Kansas. It also has kind of some characteristic leaf traits that you can look for. It has, right at the ligule, it has a pair of little clasping structures called auricles. So it's something that you can recognize. Maybe Carrie can get right down into there to see where those auricles are on that leaf. So this is a very recognizable grass. It is one that establishes very quickly from seed and is fast growing. You can tell by the fact that it's well into flower now that this is also a cool season grass, or a grass that completes much of its life cycle earlier and during the cooler parts of the season. Many of the dominant prairie grasses, on the other hand, are warm season grasses that are just now starting to put up their flower stalks. We're not seeing a lot of those in this second year planting yet, but we'll take a closer look and we'll probably get to see some of those things. Justin also mentioned that there's oxeye that is pretty common in a second year planting. And so you can see that it's another one of those members of our composite family. You can see that it has disc florets in the center of the composite head, and it's got these ray florets around that as a daisy-like flower that provides a platform for pollinators to land. This one's pretty much on its way out, but this is a common thing that's blooming right now in the second year planting. Another one that I wanted to highlight while we're here is this gray head or yellow coneflower. This is another thing in the composite family, has some superficial resemblance to the black-eyed Susans as well. One of the interesting things to watch and observe about this one is as it flowers, the disc florets emerge and mature in rings around that cone. And it's really amusing to watch the little bees work their way in circles around that cone as they gather the pollen from it. This one also has fairly unique leaves, so it's pretty recognizable by those deeply lobed, almost divided leaves when you're looking at it just prior to its blooming season. Justin mentioned that it's always useful to look closely and to actually get down into the vegetation to see more things, so we'll kind of do a little bit of that. Oh yeah, I wanted to point out, he mentioned mare's tail as being one of the weeds that's common in that the first year planting. I wanted to show you some mare's tail over here. So here it is, this tiny little suppressed thing. So we've done our establishment year mowing. Now we've got these prairie plants take off the second year, and the annual weeds like this mare's tail are greatly suppressed. Somebody also asked if that annual native, the Chamacrista or partridge pea, would reseed itself. And here's some evidence that it does. But you can see it's not taking over the site. It's just finding its own little niche and persisting here in the kind of the understory of this more established planting. Now, when you're looking at this view here, you can also still see that there's quite a lot of bare ground yet. But we do have that closed canopy above that helps to kind of control the light levels and compete with the potential weeds. Just found something else while getting down close to the ground here. That kind of serrated edge tells me that's and that white midrib tells me that that is a wild quinine plant, even though it's not blooming yet. So we're going to step just across the boundary into the third year planting and take a look at how that's a little bit different yet from the second year planting. One of the first things that you can notice right here, this is kind of a carefully chosen area because you can start to see that there's a little bit less dominance of the Canada wild rye. So it's a native grass, it's a perennial, but it's less competitive. And you can start to see a little bit more action from our some of our other native grasses. So right here's one of my favorites, there's Cytodes grama. You can see it has colorful stamens right now that are releasing their pollen. Also, right next to that, there's a switchgrass that is just getting ready to flower. So our native warm season grasses are just starting to kick into high gear. let's see. There are some other cool things in this particular spot. Ah, yeah. Here is a little brome that's technically a perennial, but often short-lived. This is Calm's brome that has these kind of blunt and fuzzy spikelets within its beautiful panicle. So this one's a fun one to watch out for, not to be confused with smooth brome, which is going to have more elongated, slender spikelets that aren't fuzzy like these. So Calm's brome is a nice one to look for. We have some purple flowers right here. This is a native verbena. This is hoary vervain. The hoary refers to the white hairs on the stem that make it look like it's almost frosty, also on the leaves. This one likes a little bit of disturbance, so a fairly young planting like this is a perfect place for it to be. So our hoary vervain. Wanted to highlight a couple. Oh, haha. This is just like walking around. Oh, squirrel, squirrel. Here's one of our mint family members. And this one, oh my gosh, you can see it in some of the CRP pollinator plantings as you drive around and also in roadsides. I think this was one of our plants of the day at one point. This is Monarda or bee balm or wild bergamot. Some things to notice on it. It's a member of the mint family. It has irregular flowers. It has these long floral tubes, long-tongued bees like it. Also, if you're a short-tongued bee or a wasp, you might just pierce the side of it and suck the nectar out without having to go past the pollen. The stems are square, as they generally are for the mint family, and you'll see that the leaves are opposite each other on the stem. So this is a pretty easy one to identify, and Carrie told me before we got started with this that she loves the smell of the leaves. It helps to rub them a little bit, so it's kind of like a scratch and sniff thing when you were a little kid. And then just, that smell is just so herbal and aromatic. It's really lovely. Okay, so that's one of our mint family members. We also have a couple of the legumes that are out here besides the partridge pea, and I think we're gonna go do a little bit of a trek, Carrie, if you're ready.
While we're walking, can I ask you a question, Laura?
Certainly.
So there was a question about something you said at the very beginning about the plugs and where you source those plugs from.
We source those by growing them ourselves in our greenhouse. Some of that is from seed that was harvested in the area right around Urban Prairie. There's some roadside populations that are pretty neat. Like there's a special, quite rare plant that we found called Veratrum virginicum, or bunchflower, and we've grown some of those out as seedlings in the greenhouse and planted them out. So yeah, those are things that we grow ourselves and source those ourselves.
Great.
Good question.
And I just want to let you know we just have a couple minutes left.
Okay, so this legume that I want to highlight is just, this one is Illinois tick trefoil. One of the identifying features of this are the seed, well, technically not pods, they're called loments, but the fruits anyway are sticky, and they have several segments that will detach and stick to animal fur or your own clothing. But these are a legume that are very beneficial in the ecosystem for their ability to fix nitrogen. But all parts of this plant are sticky, so we like to say that this is like a botany badge. You can wear this on your shirt. Whoops, mine didn't stick. There we go. Now I've got my botany badge. You'll also notice that leaf is, it's a divided or compound leaf, as is true for those, for almost all of the legumes. I guess with that, Jorgen, should we have some closing remarks? Did anybody want to sort of wrap things up today, or do we have more questions?
Yeah, we do have another question. So someone asked, would it be okay to mow a walking path through the restored prairie?
Oh my goodness. In fact, that's what we have. There are walking paths through Irvine Prairie. They're kind of multi-purpose paths in that we are also using them to define the edges of our burn units, and they will help function as partial burn breaks when we add a burn regime to the area. I think if you're talking about a CRP planting or that kind of thing, I would check with your NRCS office and make sure that that's allowable for you to mow through it.
Yeah, that would be my advice too. If you have.
I just about got stung. I squeezed the little bee, and I was afraid that I'd hurt her. Sorry.
I was just going to say, if you do
hazard.
have a prairie restoration that's enrolled in CRP, you'll probably need to check with the NRCS to make sure you're not
Exactly.
rules. But I will
Yeah.
just say that I posted in the chat a link to the Tallgrass Prairie Center's website page for Irvine Prairie. So they can find that in the chat. And then I'm also going to post a link to some information about another virtual prairie walk that we're hosting with Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation on Friday. And then we have another virtual prairie walk with you guys coming up on the 29th, correct?
Yeah, that's the roadside one with Christine, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's wonderful. Can I showcase one last plant before we go?
You sure can.
Okay, because I think Carrie and I may have stepped on it on our way. No, there it is. Okay, so we just want to highlight, we've been seeing tons of monarchs as we've been walking out here. And so we do have a couple of different species of milkweeds out here. Here's the common milkweed. I'm just going to show the milk from that, and its wonderful opposite leaves. And this is, of course, known as the host for the monarch caterpillars. We also have butterfly milkweed and whorled milkweed on site. There's 17 species of milkweeds that have been reported from Iowa, and about 5 of those are widespread plants. So we're doing our part, and it's really a joy to see all of the things that are moving in now to inhabit this site. And thank you for posting those web links so that people will visit Urban Prairie on our website, as well as coming out here in person to check it out.
Yeah, well, thank you, Laura. It's not the same as being in the prairie with you, but it's probably the next best thing.
And thanks for coming along for the walk.
Yep. Justin, any closing comments?
Folks, just would encourage folks to come out and visit, and we'll be doing more restoration on this site the next couple of years, so you can come out here to kind of bone up on restoration progression and the different plants. So this will be a pretty cool site to be able to kind of walk through time. So would invite everybody out here. So
Don't forget to bring your binoculars. The birds are fantastic.
Yes, absolutely.
Good to know. Well, thank you both, and thanks everyone for attending.
All right, thank you, everybody.